This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
All right, welcome back again, guys. I'm Steve Guerra, host of the History of the Papacy podcast, and I'm with Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast, and we are going to look at another movie that we hate. And today we are talking about the Davinci Code. So I'm sure that one's going to bring a lot of interesting emotions. So take it away, Scott. Take it away, Scott. Why don't you give us a little overview of this great film?
I don't even know where to start. Well, okay, I have to start with Dan Brown. Dan Brown is the William Shakespeare of bad writing, if that analogy makes any sense at all. No, I should say he's the Antichrist of William Shakespeare. He's one of the worst writers in the English language. And I mean, just to give you an idea of how the book Davinci Code starts out is: renowned curator Jacques Sonner staggered through the vaulted archway of the museum's Grand Gallery. So the word renowned probably comes up about 6,000 times in his book. Everyone is renowned. And I thought with this podcast, Steve, actually, we should refer to each other as renowned podcasters. So I'm honored to be with you, the renowned podcaster, Steve Guerra. And there's a review of one of Dan Brown's most recent books in The Guardian, and the writer wrote in the style of Dan Brown. It's hilarious. He says, "Every night, renowned writer prayed to renowned deity, God, thanking him for his renowned wealth." And so, okay, Dan Brown, he's a bad writer. The other thing that I love is all of his books focus on the protagonist, Robert Langdon, a symbiology professor, which is not a profession, I should note. Iconography is a subfield of art history. Symbologist is not a real thing. Dan Brown, I don't think, even though his protagonist is a college professor at Harvard, I don't think he's ever been to college before, because he seems to think that the job of a professor is basically a children's librarian, where you say things and you startle your students. And the funniest scenes are when you flash back to Robert Langdon in class and says, "Now, class, did you know that people think that the medieval image of God with this beard came from Zeus?" And it describes the students getting wide-eyed as if they're children being read The Foolish Tortoise at story time. And so he's a silly... Okay, I don't want to get too far into Dan Brown's badness. We're going to come back to it. It's going to be hard to stay on track here. Don't like Dan Brown as a writer. The film Davinci Code, but all to say that the book was a smash success, sold hundreds of millions of copies. So it's inevitable that you would have a movie. The movie came out in 2006, all-star cast, Ron Howard director, starring Tom Hanks with hair that makes him look like a younger Joe Biden. Audrey Tautou, who was if you needed a French actress before Marion Cotillard became big in the last few years, that's who you would get. Amélie, if you saw that movie. Ian McKellen, Gandalf is in it. Paul Bettany, he's the homicidal albino monk. So that's the Davinci Code. And so all-star cast, a lot of money behind it, a lot of good production, takes itself very seriously, interesting concepts, packaged up in an airport fiction book. And I'm going to hop between the movie and the book a lot in this review. They really track pretty similar. The book is just more, the movie is more truncated, but there's very little difference between the two. So I don't know. Do you have anything to say, Steve, before I get into the synopsis?
Well, if I had to defend this movie, and you're really, really pushing me on, I have to defend this movie. That's my role today. I mean, Tom Hanks had cool hair. Symbology would probably be a cool major for a PhD if there was such a thing. I mean, you're really pushing me. This movie was, it was interesting. I will say one thing. When the book came out, when did the book come out? Around 2003, give or take. It did get a lot of children who I think this was more, I mean, even if it was written for an adult audience, it was definitely young adult caliber. It got, 13-year-olds who were, first exploring that, though, I'm busting my church school teacher, my Sunday school teacher. It definitely got them involved in history. Now, whether they grew out and realized that maybe not everything in this novel was necessarily the truth, despite what Dan Brown claims, maybe it did get some teenagers interested in history.
Right. And in one sense, Dan Brown isn't indicted so much as humanity for being so interested in it. And you do have a point. I have met people who I could tell their ideas came from this book. So it's sort of like if you grew up watching WWE and you love Triple H and Stone Cold Steve Austin, and then that got you into serious martial arts, then that's sort of what Davinci Code is to understanding the past. So, I guess I should say, I'm going to dog on this completely, but something positive is the book is absolute total mind fodder. It is sugar in book form. If you have a long haul flight across an ocean, this is a great book. It's completely mindless, completely addictive. You forget about it the second you're done. So that's a good thing about it.
Yeah, my daughter always talks about books are like food. There's healthy food books, like healthy food, and then there's, like you said, there's eating a huge bag of Doritos.
Yeah, I was about to say pixie stick, but that's at least sugar. I'd say more like Dots, something that's pure corn syrup. So that's what it's 5 pounds of Dots or Red Vines you would get from Costco. Consumes great. What happens afterwards is all right. So I should say what the plot is. Now, the idea is pretty interesting. Dan Brown did not come up with it, but it's a part of the controversy behind it. And it seems silly that this was such a big culture war issue back in 2003, this book of all things. But it's because it approaches a novel idea and it's revisionist history. So here's what it is. Basically, it starts with our renowned curator about to die by, spoiler alert, an albino monk. And the albino monk, or the curator, is a member of the Priory of Sion, this secret group that we'll learn about later. He is hiding, the monk is killing him to get the keystone, which is the MacGuffin in the book and the movie. It's a critical item to search for the Holy Grail. Well, the French police can only call up one man to solve this, and that is renowned symbologist Robert Langdon and renowned cryptographer Sophie Neveu. And Dan Brown always has these throwaway female love interests who are cryptographers or biologists or whatever, but they're pretty interchangeable. So they find the keystone, then they find it's a cryptix that has to be unlocked by a clue. This is kind of like a Hardy Boys book. They need the help of another renowned scholar, Sir Lee Teabing, an Englishman who lives in a mansion who knows about the Holy Grail, played by Ian McKellen in the movie. They go to his mansion, and this is where you get the mother of all exposition dumps. In the movie, he actually shows a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not making it up. And he gives the whole, just kind of like what the thrust of the Davinci Code is, where Teabing thinks that Jesus didn't die. If you know your real history, that you would know based on the Gnostic Gospels that he actually married Mary Magdalene, they had children, and that the Holy Grail is the tomb of Mary Magdalene. So then another clue sends our scrappy band of our Scooby-Doo gang to Isaac Newton's tomb, and then this is where things get odd, where Dan Brown shows his peccadillos. That this gets into kind of like the primordial theories of matriarchy society, where before the patriarchy took over, there was a matriarchy and there were fertility rituals and stuff like that. And our French female protagonist says that her grandparents were involved in this to celebrate the sacred feminine. So that's a theme that comes out a lot, that there was the sacred feminine that was celebrated, and you can find it in the original interpretation of the Bible and the Gnostic Gospels, but it was gradually covered up by the Roman Empire, and then definitely covered up by the medieval Catholic Church and medieval society. But then freethinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton hid clues in their works to show this kind of undercurrent, this sacred secret passed on knowledge, the cultic knowledge passed from person to person to kind of reassert the sacred feminine. So then in a Scooby-Doo reveal, T-Big shows that he's behind the curator's murder because he wants to find the Holy Grail, which he thinks is a series of documents that proves Jesus married Mary Magdalene and bore children, and he thinks that this will destroy the Vatican. Our female protagonist, Sophie, finds out she is a descendant of this union, and then finds out that the descendants are the Holy Grail, the Sangria, or the Sacred Blood. And then at the end of the book, Langdon finds out that the pyramid in front of the Louvre was commissioned and built by a member of the Priory of Sion, and it's actually over the tomb of Mary Magdalene. And that shows how deep the conspiracy really goes. So that's the overview. I'm going to get into why I don't like it, and this is going to be a lot to unpack, but anything you think, Steve, before I get into it?
Oh, it just, the whole movie, because it goes to the heart of what I do in my podcast as I talk about all these things, and there's just so much wrong with everything in the movie. Just basics are all wrong, but I'll try and find a way to defend it.
Yeah, I'll when I want to talk about how this could have been good, I'll have a lot to ask you because you have an entire podcast on the papacy, and it's like if you want to focus on bad things about the papacy, there's plenty of bad apples to choose out. They just decided to go after fictional things. I don't know why. So
yeah, go with the real stuff. No.
Yeah, there's plenty. So
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Here's the problem. Now, this is the big idea that this book gets wrong, but it's not just this book. It's a lot of things I've seen. This big idea of the sacred feminine, that the Gnostic origins of Christianity or Judaism. Dan Brown has this idea that if you go back in prehistory, then there was matriarchal society and things were better, and you can see it all over the place. And they would claim that as Christianity came along and Constantine decided to get rid of the Gnostic Gospels in one fell swoop, the sacred feminine was suppressed, and all the different things in Greek mythology like Venus and Isis or symbols of fertility and reproduction were suppressed. Here's this idea is very attractive to a lot of people, the sacred feminine. I think, especially in feminist scholarship, and I'll try avoid stepping on any landmines here. And what backs me up is a friend of mine who's an archaeologist. She's a very strong feminist, but thinks that this idea is completely ridiculous, the sacred feminine in history. The reason the idea is attractive, because the 21st century movement of feminism, there's an idea that you want to think that this is how it was in humanity's innocent form, and then there was a conspiracy to back it up. However, and for example, in ancient archaeology, there's the Kukatani Trypillian culture in Ukraine, where there's archaeology that goes back 3,000 or 4,000 years. There's plenty of goddesses there. People have argued, oh, there's only goddesses, so this is the sacred feminine. No, the ancient Greeks had plenty of goddesses, and they were perfectly fine being brutal and mistreating people all over the place. So, I mean, I get the idea that you want to think there's this kind of Garden of Eden state, but just because man's kind of early condition wasn't what it is today means that we kind of have to fictionalize it. I mean, for example, slavery goes back to the earliest ages of civilization, as far as I can tell. And we got rid of it, and I'm glad we got rid of it. And we don't have to pretend that there was some Garden of Eden state where there wasn't slavery. So just because things weren't really good at our earliest stages doesn't mean we have to pretend it is. So this is a trend I see all over the place. But anyway, that's a general thing. Now I want to get into the nitty-gritty of what he gets wrong. There is such a glorious passage in what T-Bing says, and renowned symbology professor Robert Langdon agrees about the evils of the Catholic Church, that is just like, I just want to focus on one paragraph because it is a rich, rich vineyard of stupidity. And here it goes. And it's mostly repeated by Ian McKellen. Tom Hanks's Robert Langdon pushes back a little bit against it, but here it goes. The Catholic Inquisition published the book that arguably could be called the most blood-soaked publication in human history, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Witch's Hammer, which indoctrinated the world to the dangers of free-thinking women and instructed the clergy how to locate, torture, and destroy them. So, first of all, that's fake. The book was written by two friars who did not have the endorsement of the church, and witch hunts really weren't a medieval thing. They were an early modern thing during the 30 Years' War. I have a whole podcast on that. You can go into it. Then he says that those deemed witches by the church included all female scholars. No, they're really... Where would you find a female scholar? There was like Catherine of Siena, but she was basically canonized into the church. So I don't know what that means. Then she says priestesses. Okay, again, there were no priestesses in the Catholic Church. Gypsies are persecuted. Nope, wrong again. That's the Holocaust. You're getting your Holocaust and your medieval, stuff mixed up. Then they said mystics were persecuted. Again, I have no idea what they mean by mystics. Like Catherine of Siena, you have Catholic mystics, but these people were revered. It's like he thinks that there are these pagan holdovers, but paganism is basically gone by the 6th or 7th century. So this just isn't a thing. Then he says other people who were persecuted were nature lovers. So you mean everyone? I mean, who didn't love nature in the Middle Ages? Everyone lived in nature. Then they said that herb gatherers were persecuted. Again, everyone? Everyone was an herb gatherer. Everyone used herbs for medicine. And then they said any women suspiciously attuned to the natural world. Again, everyone was attuned to the natural world. So it's like there's he thinks that there's a secret group of, New Age, like this practitionism of New Age that's happening in the Middle Ages that's not happening. So that's false. Another thing they mentioned just in passing is that Constantine personally elevated Jesus from teacher to deity at the Council of Nicaea, getting rid of the Gnostic Gospels, got rid of Thomas, got rid of Philip, got rid of Mary Magdalene and Judas, and and those Gnostic Gospels give us the truth. Now, there's plenty of biblical scholarship that doubts the original 4 Gospels, but will say that these Gnostic Gospels they come at least a century later, so they're much less historically grounded. And there was no vote at the Council of Nicaea to create the canon out of thin air. I mean, the arguments over the canon start long before 325, and they continue long afterwards. And it's not like Constantine is hammering things out. The Syriac Christians in Persia had their own canon, and they were actually more exclusive than Latin Christians. It's not like anyone was seriously thinking of including the Gnostic Gospels in there. So
then the Ethiopian Christians had way more books in their canon. So it's not like there was and the Catholic Church had a slightly different canon for a long time than the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, this is something that the Council of Nicaea was important, but it's just one tiny corner of Christendom, and this is not anything by any means to settle it all. So that's just a very simple, dumb shortcut that happens.
Yeah, just as a little footnote, I believe that the official Catholic canon was not set officially until the Council of Trent, which was in the 12 or the 1300s. I should have looked that factoid up, but not at Nicaea, about 1,000 years later.
Yeah, this is pretty off. So that's a big one right there. There was this horror movie when I was in high school. Well, I think it was called Stigmata, and it also talks about that the Gospel of Thomas is the real. That's the real stuff, man. But the church is just hiding it up, and that gets into the government's poisoning us and sending have to wear tinfoiled hats because they're putting X-rays into our brain stuff. No, there's interesting ideas in there, I'm sure. Or, from a scholar's standpoint, it's very interesting. Don't get me wrong on how it formed and who wrote it and the message they're trying to get across, but the idea that it's any more accurate than the earlier one. Then when there's the exposition dump with Sir Lee T-Bing, he talks about all the Davinci sacred feminine stuff, that the Mona Lisa was painted by Leonardo as an androgynous version of himself to show the whole of humanity being reunited by both genders coming together. No one follows that. So there's just all these stupid half-baked ideas that are presented as fact, but then they're never challenged by anyone else. And here's one example that if you just think about it for half a second, you realize, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. And that's where they're talking about how the Eucharist was taken from other religious practices. And there's plenty of scholarly argument that, Roman religious practices or Alexandrian religious practices, that's where the Eucharist comes from, whatever. Robert Langdon says that the Eucharist was borrowed from the Aztecs. How did Catholics steal the Eucharist from the Aztecs when they had no contact with each other until 1500? Unless, there are Catholics I don't know of that sailed across a new world in the 1st century. So that's definitely not happening. Basically, the sum of it is that almost all of these ideas about the Holy Grail actually being the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, all of it is ripped off from a 1982 book called Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. The authors of that book actually took Dan Brown to court for plagiarism, and he came back and said that I didn't actually read the book. My wife read the book, and she would give me short plot synopses of a couple paragraphs, and then I would work that into my book. So it's like a high school student being busted for plagiarism, and he said, well, somebody else read it, and then they just gave me a summary of the Cliff Notes version, and that's how I wrote it. So Dan Brown was exonerated, but really was he? So there's your defense. Those are a few of the ideas I have on the Davinci Code. I probably have a ton more, but tell me why it's awesome, Steve. You're the one defending it in this episode.
I thought it was kind of interesting. They brought up groups like Opus Dei, which isn't murderers, as far as I know. I don't think they've been convicted of it, of being, having a deep-rooted conspiracy to murder scholars in the Louvre. There's so many little snippets of things that are interesting and that have some truth, and then he just barrels right through them. I think that's probably the best way to defend this movie, is that it's a lot of lost opportunities, little things that could have been a lot of fun and really opened up people to real history, and then he just fills it up with garbage.
Yeah, it's this is another thing too. This doesn't have to do with factual inaccuracy, but I'm amused by how bad he is at a writer. Well, frequently there's going to be an action scene, and then the book goes to a dead stop where if Robert Langdon is escaping assassins, and he runs in front of a cathedral with his female companion, whoever she is in whatever book, the book will stop and spend 1 or 2 paragraphs mentioning the history of that building. That's the pacing of an episode of Dora the Explorer, where Dora stops and turns to the camera and says, "Can you count how many monkeys there are in the trees?" And Dora at least teaches you Spanish. So, I mean, I have to give it to Dora. Like, Dora has much better pacing than a book like this. And the books the movies, they're competently produced. So they're not nearly as clumsy as that. So there's a lot of half-baked ideas in there, but I think why it's so attractive and why they become such a phenomena, and the books of Dan Brown sell so well, is you do feel a little bit smarter, or you hear something that you think, ooh, like a little kind of a secret little bit of information. You took something that I thought I knew very well and you spice it up. So he would say that if you look in the background of the Mona Lisa, the background behind her, the terrain, the left side is higher than the right side. That's because the left is associated with the feminine traditionally. So that is Leonardo's hidden clue that the sacred feminine is imbued with all of his works. And that's not true. That's probably just Da Vinci painting a hilly terrain, and Mona Lisa just so happened to be placed in front of it in such a way that the left side of the terrain looks higher than the right side. But you read that and you feel smarter. So you don't have to know about art history to be able to glom onto that fact and feel better about it. So I think that's something that is attractive to.
I think this book has given more people fodder to post online or to try and refute, so to speak, Catholics or Christians. Everything you see so many rejoinders on, say, Twitter or Facebook, and somebody will bust out a fact about the Council of Nicaea or some early church thing like the Gnostics, and it's straight out of Dan Brown.
Right, and if people want to really dig into this, there's a wonderful website called historyversusthedavincicode.com. It was written by one of my favorite medieval history bloggers, Tim O'Neill. I had him as a guest on my now defunct podcast, History in 5 Minutes, ages ago. Tim's an interesting guy. He's an atheist, but he is a staunch defender of the medieval Catholic Church. So he has a master's in medieval studies. He really knows his stuff. Oh, man. So he's not defending what the bad things that the church did, but these types of half-baked historical ideas, he really tears into it. And so he's, I think, like a sort of a good middleman to get above sort of the silly culture wars that this book brought out a while ago. But even when I was going to Istanbul, I sat next to a woman who was going to Istanbul to visit her son, who was an English teacher there. And I asked her about some of the sites she wanted to see, and we mentioned the Hagia Sophia, the church commissioned by Justinian that was the largest church in the world for 1,000 years. If you're in Istanbul, definitely go see it. And she said, "Oh yeah, I can't wait to see it, to really see the hidden ideas of the sacred feminine." And I think I said to her, "Did you read the Davinci Code?" And she got excited. Yeah. And I said, "Well, what do you mean by sacred feminine?" "Well, there's mosaics of Mary in there." And I thought, okay, I mean, an Orthodox, the Theotokos, is a big idea. Yeah, I mean, there's images of Mary, but you can find plenty of belief systems in Old Norse mythology. There's plenty of female characters there, but that doesn't mean that the Vikings were very progressive in their gender politics, I would say. The raping and pillaging would argue against it. And with the Mongols as well, I'm sure in their paganistic, animistic pantheon, there were probably plenty of females as well, but that doesn't really mean anything. So it's gone far and wide, and that's another example of it. But wow, I'm overwhelmed by how much there is that could be done to unpack. Anything else, Steve, that jumps out to you that you want to address? I can't believe that's in the.
A lot of the things that are just really basic errors, like the Council of Nicaea had virtually nothing to do with Gnosticism. I think there was one canon that specifically called out a certain set of Gnostics who really weren't tied in at all to like these Gospels. They may have used one or two, but that the fact of the matter that most of the Gnostic Gospels were written just well after the 4 canonical Gospels. Like, this isn't something that the Catholic Church says. Even the scholars who would put the latest date of the canonical Gospels, the Gospel of John, that's still probably 100 years before any of the earliest dating of any of the Gnostic Gospels. The only one being the exception of the Gospel of Thomas, which is really early. And that one really doesn't fit well with the other Gnostic Gospels. It's not as Gnostic as what maybe someone like Elaine Pagels would say it is. And Elaine Pagels, who is a famous Harvard, she teaches at Harvard Divinity School, and she's a scholar, particularly of the Gnostic Gospels. She loved this movie. She had to say that there were some problems with it, but she thought that it nailed something special about the Gnostic Gospels.
Yeah, and there's a lot more. I'm not an art historian, so I can't speak accurately on whether it's correct or not, but there are some. If you know more, you could pull out tons of other things, such as Robert Langdon describing certain cathedrals as drab when they're these soaring Gothic cathedrals that are anything but that. There's one other thing, too. There's obviously a lot of focus on Leonardo da Vinci. The biggest thing he gets wrong is even the very title of the book, the Davinci Code. His name was not Da Vinci. Da Vinci just means of Vinci. That is a demonym, signifier of where you're from. That would be like calling Jesus of Nazareth, or Lawrence of Arabia, of Arabia. So if you get the title wrong right off the bat, that's problems. But he falls into the common kind of misconceptions of Leonardo, where he is this truth seeker, the building war machines, this sort of technological genius. Leonardo was a craftsman. He drew pretty pictures of airplanes, but nothing he drew would have flown. So he was an artisan who was paid to do what his patron wanted him to do. He wasn't this kind of Tony Stark technical genius who was building things centuries ahead of his time. So Dan Brown, if there's a wrong way to think about how something happens in history, he manages to fall in every single hole that you can, where not understanding the paganism in the Middle Ages, which didn't really exist, or witch hunts, he gets that wrong. He gets the Council of Nicaea wrong. He gets the canonization of Scripture wrong. Everything that you could get wrong, he manages to get wrong. And it's an impressive feat in its own way. What else? Well, I have a couple of ideas on how to make it better. So let me just throw out a few of them. and tell me what you think, Steve. My first idea, and I'd love to hear your feedback because you looked at the popes much more closely than I have. If you want to look at conspiracy theories of the church hiding something, of the church persecuting people and being bad, you don't have to make stuff up about medieval witch hunts. You don't have to make up conspiracies about true books being hidden. There's plenty of weird popes that you could look at that actually did happen. And my favorite historical example is the Cadaver Synod in the 9th century, where this is when the papacy was in a really weird place. But the Pope is Stephen VI, and he wants to get revenge on his predecessor, Pope Formosus, that he thought had wronged him. The problem was that Pope Formosus was dead. So Stephen didn't let that stop him. He arranged a court date, and he ordered Formosus's 9-month-old corpse to be exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and propped up on a throne to be tried for his crimes. So Stephen rages at Formosus's corpse. Formosus does not respond, and turns out the cadaver loses the trial. So I think that's pretty messed up. I think that's a good example. Can you think of any other examples?
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, that whole 8th, 9th, 10th century papacy was so bad. That was worse than anything of the Borgias and the late Renaissance papacy. There was a period in that 8th, 9th, 10th century that they called the pornocracy, because every pope was just so bad. That's when the traditional telling of the Pope Joan story comes from, where there was supposedly a female pope, which kind of ties in well with this with this movie. I'm shocked that Dan Brown didn't tap into that one. But later writers reading about the chronicles of things that had happened during this time, like there was so much fodder for them to come up with, just horrific stories of things that had happened then. Actually, the Renaissance popes were actually reformers for the most part, but you could pick out any number of stories. There was a pope who bought his office, sold it, bought it back again, sold it again. Just one good story after another. To pick this whole, I think Dan Brown could have picked so many better stories to tell. I think you're right on that one. Was there anything else that you think that he could have, maybe some other things that were missing or under the surface that he could have maybe tied a better conspiracy theory around?
Well, in terms of religious relics, the Holy Grail, I have to say that's pretty weak, especially since Dan Brown makes a big deal, I think, on the first page of all of his books, that names have been fictionalized. All other statements in this book are based on historical fact. That's what he leads with. And to say it so blatantly, a real academic historian would have the humility not to say something like that. Usually a real academic historian, their book begins with an acknowledgement section where they have some good self-deprecating humor of talking about with people, and then they'll say, any mistakes are purely the author's mistakes. So they'll own up to stuff, and they have some humility, but then they dive in. That's what a real historian does. Dan Brown is like the flat earth conspiracy theories, who, if you actually challenge them on things, they'll say, no, man, your sources are wrong. Just look it up, man. They'll always say that line. Just look it up. Just look it up. Look what up? The earth isn't flat. What are you talking about? Just look it up, man. And that's sort of how he starts his book. Just look it up. So I'll have to say, the Holy Grail, it's popular in Arthurian legend. That's good. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, great. If you really want to base it on holy relics that's a whole separate issue of Catholic doctrine on if it's actually efficacious or not. So let's just forget about that. But whether it historically was what it claims to be, there's much better relics to chase around. There's, for example, Empress Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine. She founded churches, and many people think that she discovered the hiding places of the true cross, the cross that was used for the crucifixion of Jesus. Pieces of the true cross are in churches all over Europe. Crusaders went on crusades, and they took home many indulgences of dubious validity, saying, hey, here's the hip bone of the colt that took Jesus in on Palm Sunday. Hey, here's an egg laid by the dove when the Holy Spirit descended in the form of a dove. So stuff like that isn't very valid, but Helena's piece of the true cross, well, I don't know. It's 3 centuries removed from the event, so it's at least plausible, I suppose. I mean, as good as many other historical artifacts from the... So that's one thing. I mean, if whatever your MacGuffin is, and for listeners who don't know, MacGuffin is just basically the item that the protagonist is after. It doesn't really matter what it is. Indiana Jones is looking for the Ark of the Covenant. It doesn't really matter. It's the Ark. You just care about Indy and you care about his adventure. I guess Davinci Code, the whole book does tie into this conspiracy theory. So, but really, you just want to watch the Scooby-Doo hijinks of Robert Langdon, and you're not going for big ideas. So tie it to some sort of religious relic that's more historically plausible. So that's my idea. What do you think, Steve?
I think that's really what you get to, is that he could have taken anything and wrote a story about it. Don't sell it that it's true. Write a story. He probably could have written a much better story if he was a better writer, but don't pretend that you're uncovering a historical fact. If that's the case, then you should be writing a book with footnotes and endnotes and a bibliography. Don't write it in a fictionalized novel.
This is another thing too, is the book completely misunderstands how history. Lee Teabing, Ian McKellen in the movie, he thinks that at some point he will be able to find documentation that proves Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, and that will bring down the Catholic Church. History doesn't work that way. It's not like there's secret documents of, oh, here's Emperor Nero's secret diary that he wrote the night that he fiddled while Rome burned, and it's hidden in the catacombs, and only by solving these clues can we find it. Or here's the lost final will and testimony of Alexander, of how he would have divided up his empire. And here's Muhammad's final letter that he didn't want anyone to know about. And history just does not... I mean, if something like that ever did exist, it would have been mentioned by people. You couldn't keep that secret because that information like that just doesn't remain hidden. We definitely wouldn't have it in autograph form because we have almost nothing of importance in autograph form except for monuments and inscriptions. It would have been a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy found in some scriptorum in a medieval monastery that had hopped from Greek to Latin, probably Greek to Arabic to Syriac to Latin, and that's how it would exist if it did exist. And then the movie is even stupider because Tom Hanks stumbles across a genealogy that directly links the female protagonist back to King David. Like, hey, I just found a genealogy going back to the 10th century BC. Those are just laying around all the time on papyrus. That stuff definitely doesn't disintegrate after a century. That stuff stays around for 3,000 years, no problem. So it's just, history doesn't work that way, Dan Brown.
Well, I think you've made a rather strong case in hating this movie, and I've made the best case I possibly can make in defending the movie. So it's definitely up to the people who are listening. Come out and show your love. Either you hate the movie or you love it. I think we can have a big conversation about this movie for sure.
Oh, well, there's one last thing I'd like to mention. There is something good that did come out of this, I want to say. Oh, you know what? It wasn't this movie. It was the other Dan Brown one, Inferno. Okay, so anyway, I've gone this far. I'll say it anyway. When Tom Hanks was promoting the movie based on Dan Brown's Inferno, he was on Saturday Night Live, and that's when he did David S. Pumpkins. I don't know if you've seen that character, but it's basically one of the best skits of all times. Look it up on YouTube if you don't know what I'm talking about. It's the best thing ever. So that was what Tom Hanks gave us while promoting this movie, but it wasn't even the Davinci Code. It was Inferno. So I guess I have nothing positive to say. So that's all I have.
Well, you have David S. Pumpkins to add to it. So definitely go to History Unplugged on Facebook. We're on Twitter with A to Z History page. So anywhere you want to go, we're definitely going to be talking about these movies, and definitely tune in for more movies that we love and we hate.